Hello! Related to this week's Substack, in this video I'm going to show you the craziest game by far that I have ever played. The mess that I created in this game even today makes me look at this game with a utter shock, I would say. The game was played in a tournament that I won, and that tournament was actually my first Grandmaster norm. It was played against the player, Julian Radulski, who at that time was not yet a Grandmaster. He was an international master then, but later on he did become a Grandmaster and reached the rating of 2600. So let's see the game. In those days I was playing the King's Indian exclusively against d4, and this game was not an exception. So d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, knight f3, short castle, bishop e2, e5, and now short castle. So Radulski allowed me to play the Mar del Plata variation with knight c6. It's curious that some years prior to this game he beat me very easily using the close Sicilian. But for some reason in this game he went for d4. It was the first and the last time he played d4 against me, because in the next game that we played some years later, he again played the close Sicilian, but that time I played better, and that game finished in a draw. Nowadays the Mar del Plata is not the same opening that it used to be when this game was played in 1998. Back then, Black could still hope to create some attack or create some mess, as we will see. But nowadays, White has really found many lines where he successfully manages to prevent Black's activity and active play, and it's almost non-existent nowadays that Black gets an attack against the king. So that's why, for example, in my chessable course on the King's Indian with Black, in this position I did not recommend the Mar del Plata, which, apart from the lack of attack that is common nowadays, it also has a lot of theory involved. And for example, in that course I proposed the move bishop g4, which was successfully played by Fabiano Caruana a couple of times. But let's go back to the game. Knight c6, d5, knight e7, and now b4. This became the main line in the 90s after first Ivan Sokolov and then Vladimir Kramnik started playing it with great success. It's the most direct way for White, intending to push c5. White plays for a queenside expansion in the King's Indian and in the Mar del Plata in particular. And the big discovery in this line, because the move has been known since the 60s, but the big discovery was that after knight h5, with the idea of knight f4 or f5, White, first Ivan Sokolov, like I said, and then Vladimir Kramnik successfully started playing the move rook e1. A very nice prophylactic move, which allows after knight f4 to for the bishop to drop back to f1, from where it safely defends the king side, and the rook is also nicely positioned to support the e4 pawn. Again, a lot of theory here. I won't go into that. The main moves nowadays are f5 or a5. Back then, I was analyzing and sometimes played the move h6. The idea is to control the g5 square so that Black can play f5. The point being that after f5, knight g5 is the main move for White, attacking the knight on h5 and sometimes threatening knight e6 with big complications. So I went h6. Objectively, the move is not very good, especially looking from today's perspective, but back then it was one of the options. So now the idea is f5. So White goes knight d2, attacking the knight and stopping f5 for the time being. Knight f4, the knight is active on f4, but a lone knight cannot do much. Bishop f1, this is the prophylactic idea after rook e1, and now g5. Both g5 and f5 will be played. g5 frees the g6 square for the knight. So c5 by White, f5, g3, pushing the knight back, knight f g6, and now c takes d6. It was possible to wait with the opening of the c file. For example, white could have started with a4, but cd6 is also fine. C takes d6, c takes d6, knight c4, and f4. So we see both sides pushing their agenda. White is advancing on the queen side, these knights are here, b5, bishop a3 are ideas that are typical for white, sometimes knight b5 depending on circumstances, whereas black is trying to attack on the king side. But if you look at black's pieces, they're not really well positioned for an attack. The knight on g6 is limited by this pawn on g3. The knight on e7 is a very bad piece. It doesn't have a single square to go to. And the other, okay, the light squared bishop is fine as it should be on c8, but none of the other pieces are actually supporting the attack, and this is black's problem in this position. b5 here played by white, and here I came up with a maneuver that I have known, having studied classical games in the King's Indian. I realized that I need to rearrange my pieces in a better way if I want to create something on the king side, because as it is, black threatens nothing. Taking on g3 really brings nothing after white recaptures. The open f file is useless basically. So pushing g4 is an idea, but this also needs to be done under correct circumstances, let's say. But even just pushing g4 doesn't do much for the time being. So my idea was the following. I played the move knight h8. So the idea of the move is to free the g file for the rook. So my idea was to go rook f6, rook g6. So the rook is on the g file now, and then to go g5 and h5, h4. So to just advance with all the pawns and try to force some opening on the king side. From h8, the knight will come to f7 and defend that vulnerable spot, vulnerable pawn on d6. But as you can notice, this is rather slow, and white's play is actually faster on the queen side. So a4 played by white, g4. I continued immediately, bishop a3, and now rook f6. But rook f6 turns out to be bad because I underestimated that white can actually change his plan and start playing in the center. It was better to go knight f7 immediately, defending d7, but also controlling the e5 square. Yeah, so the knight is more immediately brought back into the game. As we will see, this knight will have a decisive part in the game, but only after surviving some unpleasant moments. So after knight f7, and now if white changes the direction and places in the game g takes f4, e takes f4, e5, after knight f5 things are rather messy. Yeah, white has broken through the center, but black's pieces are now somewhat better. The knight sprung to life to f5, both knights defend d6, the bishop is active on the long diagonal, and it's a pretty big mess. But just jumping a little bit ahead, nothing compared to what we will see in this game. So I played rook f6, intending to follow up with my plan, rook g6, knight f7, the rook also covers d6. But here my opponent surprised me with a very strong g takes f4, e takes f4, and e5. And now it turns out that white's pieces, unsurprisingly, you see how harmoniously they are placed after all, are much better prepared for the opening in the center. If you just look at black's pieces, they are just completely scattered all over the place. Yeah, and there's no harmony whatsoever. So after e5, objectively speaking, white should win. But this being a King's Indian, and a lot of, for the time being, all of the pieces being present on the board means that a lot of tactics will be involved in the position. And with every exchange of pawns, the king's safety will also become a major factor. So I took on e5, and here white had a really strong move d6, which would have won the game. So d6 immediately attacking the knight, and after knight f5, knight d5, we see how white's pieces are very well placed to immediately basically win the game. So for example, let's say rook f8, now knight e7 check. The knight cannot be taken because after d takes e7, the bishop is defending the pawn and there is a fork. Yeah, and if it's something like king h7, just taking on c8, rook c8 and d7, and both rooks are attacked and white is winning. This is just one of the many winning lines, but you will, from this moment onwards, you will notice that how complicated all these lines are. I'm just showing some of them, but on each move there would be at least a few alternatives that needed to be calculated and evaluated properly. My opponent played knight e5, which is also natural, taking the pawn and keeping still the threats. d6 is still a threat, knight g4 can be a threat, depending, yeah. So white still keeps good chances. And in this position, I played a move which it just complicates matters to the maximum, really taking it to the extreme. So if you look at the position, I have a move now. So logical would be to try to somehow use the move to at least improve some of my pieces. The knight on h8 is really just very bad piece. The knight on e7 is subject to attacks after d6. I'm lagging back in development on the queen side, and the rook on f6, okay, maybe it's doing a good job, but d6, the control of d6 means nothing because white is controlling it 2 times. So instead of trying to do something with my pieces, I actually went for g3. So ignoring all my bad pieces, just complicating it to the extreme and hoping for the best, because objectively black should be lost. But I thought, okay, just open the position of white's king and then tactics will happen, and somehow well, young players usually are good at tactics, and I was not, in calculation and tricks, and I was not an exception to that. So I was just fishing for my luck there. So my opponent went d6. So using the main trump, the passed pawn on the d file, g takes f2, check, king takes f2, and now, okay, the king is far from being safe, but objectively speaking, again, white's superior coordination and harmony of the pieces should prevail. So then the knight is attacked, now knight eg6. I'm trying to challenge this strong knight on e5. Now my opponent played bishop c4 check. Knight d5 was a winning move, going for the e7 square. For example, a simple line again, knight takes e5, rook takes e5, knight g6, trying to activate some pieces. Now the knight escaped the corner, but after rook e7, which is the strong move, white is winning. Yeah, so the rook is attacked. There are ideas like rook g7, d7, and so on. For example, knight takes e7, d takes e7, queen e8, and knight c7 wins material. Yeah, the pawn will promote, so it's game over. So this is one of the wins. Yeah, but bishop c4 is also tempting, activating the bishop with a tempo check, king h7, and now d7. So it looks also quite winning. Yeah, I mean, all white's pieces are well placed. He controls the center. I'm still pretty hopeless with my coordination. I'm just probably looks like I'm losing a bishop. But one of the rare factors working for me in this position was that my opponent was getting seriously short on time. And I have to remind you that this game was played on mechanical clocks, no increments obviously, and this was move 26. So he had like 14 moves to make until move 40, and he had minutes probably. I don't remember exactly, but I remember that Radowski was time trouble prone, and the complications already up to this point forced him to spend a lot of time. So he had minutes left to reach move 40, and this was working for me. So d7, knight takes e5. I had to take the knight that defends the pawn. Rook takes e5, bishop d7, and now why did white sacrifice the pawn? Because there are two tempting ideas here, but the difference is that one is winning and one is not. So the winning move here was the move bishop e7. So without the knight on the e file, there is e7 square controlled by the rook, so it's an attack on the rook and the queen. So the only move is to give check on b6, but after rook c5, everything is hanging. The bishop on d7, there are threats against the king from the d3 square. There are ideas like knight d5, attacking the queen, attacking the rook. The rook on f6 is hanging, so a lot of things happening. And the engine says something like +4 or more for white. But if you look at the position, it's clear that you get the impression, okay, this should be winning for white, but you also realize that it's still a mess. So white's king is still not entirely safe. There is this pin, okay, and there are things hanging, pieces are hanging all over the place. So serious calculation is required to kind of find the exact way through the complications and win the game. And as I mentioned, white was short of time. So it would not have been easy, even though objectively this is winning for white. What my opponent did was use the square for the rook e7. This also looks very tempting. So the bishop is attacked now on d7, and there are also threats with bishop d3 or queen d3 check. Yeah, or bishop d3 check. There is also knight d5, knight d4. Again, many ideas. So queen b6 check now, getting away from the d file. Yeah, king f3, and now comes the best, the most memorable part for me in this game. So I have noted in my comments to this game that at this point my opponent had 3 or 4 minutes left, and it's moved 29. So 11 moves for only 3 or 4 minutes. And again, I repeat, no increments. And here I was obviously calculating and trying to find practical chances, because I realized that, okay, probably things are not that good for me because my pieces are still not doing much. But I realized that this king on f3 should somehow give me some chances at least. And what I came up with was probably the most spectacular move I have ever played. In this completely crazy and messy position, I played the move knight f7. So it's not enough that my bishop on d7 was hanging, but now I'm putting another piece that is hanging on f7. The idea of the move is that taking the knight, for example, with the rook, allows for queen e3. So the rook is important on the e file to defend the e3 square. And taking the bishop on d7, for example, with the queen, would allow me to play rook d8 and activate my rook on the d file. I understood that this was, well, very speculative, yeah, but I kind of felt, and this is the psychological aspect when you get these very sharp calculational games and you at some point you start to feel your opponent. I felt that this would be like a complete shock for him. He was frantically calculating lines, and I was pretty sure that this was not going to be a move that he expected. And since it's not tricky to meet, there are a lot of tricky lines, there are a lot of false leads, there are a lot of mistakes to be made in the position for white. I felt that this move would give me excellent practical chances. Objectively, the move should lose. But I will show you the winning lines for white and you will see how complicated they are. So I understood that this is very complicated for white, and I thought that, okay, even if it's losing, it just gives me great chances to not only maybe save the game, but only even win, because things are very tricky for white with that king on f3. Let's step back for a moment and explain the objective truth in this position. And the objective truth is that, in fact, the move bishop g4 should draw. Now, I'm not sure if I actually saw this move at all during the game, but the lines are still pretty nice, yeah, and I will show you some of them. So check, the bishop must be taken because the queen is hanging. King takes g4, and now queen f2. Now all of a sudden the king is in danger. There are all sorts of mates like rook g6 being threatened. So bishop d3 check, rook g6 counter check, bishop takes g6, knight takes g6, and now there are still mating threats like queen g2. So now it's white's turn to save his king. Rook g7 check, king g7, and now knight e4 and queen e2 both draw. because black manages to give a perpetual. I'll give you the, I think, the more beautiful line. Knight e4, attacking the queen. Queen g2, king f5. King is trying to run away, but knight h4. Now, king takes f4, queen h2, king g4, and now h5. King g5, queen e5, and this is a very nice perpetual check. I don't remember seeing this type of pattern. King h4, queen h2. And the king cannot escape. The pawn is controlling the g4 square, and wherever the queen gives the check, defends the pawn on h5. So king g5, queen e5 with a perpetual. Very peculiar perpetual check, and not one I have seen before. So this was the objective truth in the position. It should have been a draw. But let's go back to the game. Knight f7. The amazing, stunning move, knight f7 was played. Like I said, I'm kind of, even though it's a losing move, I'm kind of proud of coming up with this move that created probably the biggest mess in any game I have ever played. Now, just to show you the tricks, yeah, how many mistakes can white make in this position. So, for example, taking the bishop with the rook d7, knight e5, loses on the spot. Just there are too many things that are hanging. It's a check, the bishop is hanging, the rook is hanging, so this just loses. Taking on f7 with the rook also loses. Queen e3 check, king g2, rook takes f7, bishop takes f7, bishop h3, king h1, rook c3, queen takes c3, and now material is equal. Actually, black is a pawn up, but it's the king safety that is decisive. The rook is attacked and the bishop is attacked, so the only move is rook a2, but after rook d8, the rook is entering the game with the decisive effect. Obviously, the rook cannot be taken on d8 because there is this queen e1 mate. Another move that is not very good after knight f7 is, let's say, bishop d3, because simply king h8, all the other threats like knight g5 are still present. So there were two, actually the winning move, and the only winning move was queen takes d7. And I understand that my opponent was afraid of rook d8, which was my idea, attacking the queen, and still threatening ideas like knight g5. And then if the king moves, maybe rook d2, queen f2, things can happen fast. But bishop d3 is the winning move. Check, king g8, rook e8 check, bishop f8. So a lot of things are like everything is hanging, yeah. And now there are two winning moves and a couple of losing ones. So, for example, rook d8, knight e5 loses the queen. Or, let's say, bishop f8, knight e5 also loses the queen. And to show you, okay, queen g4 check is met by knight g4 counter check. Yeah, and then the rook can be taken. And the winning moves are rook f8 is one, and it's probably the simplest one. After rook f8, rook e1. But again, to come up with a move rook e1 in this messy position, I'm not sure how simple it is. So that's one winning idea, and the other one is queen takes d8. And the point is that the queen is sacrificed, but after knight d8, knight d5, it turns out that black loses a lot of material. So everything is hanging and the white wins. But again, how simple is this with 3-4 minutes left on the clock and navigating all these complications? So my opponent didn't go for queen d7. He took bishop f7, eliminating the knight that threatened knight g5. But after this, the game again should be a draw. So rook takes f7, still playing on the same idea. When the rook is removed from the e file, queen e3 becomes a possibility. And here, in fact, my opponent should have taken the rook. Rook takes f7, queen e3 check, king g2, rook, bishop h3, king h1, queen takes c3. And this is very complicated. The difference from the previous line is that white has a rook, yeah, instead of a bishop. And this gives him the material advantage. But obviously, the precarious position of white's king and the activity of black's pieces make the position quite unclear. But again, in time trouble, my opponent took the other piece, queen takes d7, and now after rook d8, my idea when sacrificing the knight with knight f7, and all of a sudden the tables are turned and now black is winning. So in the span of what was it, like 2 moves from a losing position, the tables are turned and now black has a winning position. You could imagine the shock, yeah? And in fact, the shock was so great that my opponent here, frantically searching for a move to play, played a5, trying to confuse matters, yeah, counter-attacking my queen. But after queen a5, it was possible also to go queen f6, but I simply took the pawn, now introducing one more threat of queen c3. My opponent just took on d8, hoping for queen d8, which was also possible, yeah? But I just, again, tried to surprise him with my move. I played queen c3 check. And in this position, he lost on time. So on move 33, 7 moves short of the time control, he lost on time. So you could imagine the shock that he must have experienced being met by these crazy moves like g3 before, knight f7 later on, with all this complete mess on the board. After queen c3, black is objectively winning. Yeah, and I will show you the winning line. So king g2, and now f3 is the only move that wins. Again, I'm not sure I would have went for all this, but with more time left, I'm pretty sure I would have found, at least I knew that I wasn't risking losing it anymore. So king g3 now, f2, king g2, or king h4, rook f4, which leads to mate, king h5, queen h3, or king g2, queen f3, king f1, queen h1, king e2, and now f1 queen. Take on f1, queen f1, king e3, rook f3. Now it's a forced mate. King e4, check on e2, king d5, check on d3, king c5, check on c2, king b4. Of course, the queen can be taken, but queen c3, king a4, queen a3 is a mate. So yeah, it would have been perhaps nice to finish the game like this, mating the white king in a king's Indian on a4 after such a spectacular game with the tactics all over the place, crazy sacrifices, complete mess that cannot be really controlled. But okay, I won on time, and that was good enough, yeah, for this game. So this is something that, yeah, it's a game that I fondly remember, and it's a game that, again, is also a fond memory of the tournament, like I said, which I won and scored my first Grandmaster norm. So you could see, I mean, yeah, I wasn't such a bad player back then. But what is memorable for me is I think my ability to outplay a strong opponent in a crazy tactical positions by infusing, putting more fuel to the fire in a objectively losing position, but managing to complicate the matters to such an extreme that I could outplay my opponent even from an objectively losing position. So there you go. Sometimes chess can be played in a messy way and quite successfully, but I have to add that this is probably a characteristic of young players with a lot of energy, because nowadays I find it difficult to imagine myself playing in such a style. So thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe, check my Chessable courses, subscribe to my weekly Substack, which is, like I said, on messy positions and how the brain works in such situations. Follow me on Twitter, and stay tuned next week for the next video. See you soon.